Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parenting is Easy podcast, where we will discuss the pleasures and the frustrations, the good and the bad, and the rewarding and the troubling aspects of parenting. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, and I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in working with teenagers, young adults, and parents with a specific niche in assisting with communication within the family dynamics. While everyone has their own unique journey and experiences as a parent and as a child, there are many common affiliations and attributes that we can all relate to and share. Together, we will learn from personal stories and experiences from parents across many different backgrounds, cultures, and communities. So get comfortable, grab your glass of coffee, and let's get right into the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Parenting is Easy, said no one ever. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, and today we have some topics that we may have discussed a little bit before, but I think will be new, refreshing, especially from the person and the guest that we have with us today. We'll be talking some about losing a child, about relocation within the family, and also being in the healthcare world and being a parent. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest, Meredith, who has been a nurse practitioner and specifically has been a advanced certified hospice and palliative nurse practitioner and also a family nurse practitioner. She currently lives in Chicago suburbs with her husband and her dog, and she is also expecting one on the way. And she has additionally been a podcast host for a podcast for children called Open Window Stories. And hopefully we'll get a chance to hear a little bit about that. Meredith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, same here. Out of all these different topics, which one do we go through first? And I think for the one, at least for things that people are going through and for a way conversation has gone here on this podcast, I want to talk a little bit about that, the relocation aspect and how that works within the family dynamics. So I'm curious to sort of hear from you regarding what your experience has been and how that works within the family dynamics itself.
There's been a lot of relocations in my family. I met my husband when he was a resident at the University of Minnesota. And then when our daughter was 6 months old and like 4 months into the pandemic, we moved our family all the way to Palo Alto in California for him to do his fellowship in cardiovascular surgery. And then we moved back to Michigan for a year to do an advanced fellowship for him. And now here we are in Chicago. For my daughter, that has been when she was 6 months old, when she was almost 3, and then now when she was almost 4 for her relocations. So it's been a lot. And as far as that experience as a family in the pandemic, there's no comparing. Like if you're going to relocate in a pandemic, you have no frame of reference, right? We got this like, oh, we're going to California and we're going to have all these fun experiences and it'll be great because my mom lived in Nevada and it was going to be just so close by plane. And then before we did the relocation, COVID hit and we both work in healthcare. So now we are living in Palo Alto with no friends, with no family, with no travel. And surprise on top of all of that, that's when I started. It wasn't my first hospice job, but it was my first hospice job as a nurse practitioner. I was working as a hospice nurse practitioner in one of the highest COVID concentration areas in California. And I guess for that relocation with an infant, it was much just harder on us as parents. It wasn't so much hard on her. She's like, whatever, it's a new house. Like, we don't have any furniture. This is fun. She learned to crawl, she learned to walk. I didn't really notice anything specific with her. But when we left Palo Alto to go to Michigan, she was like 2.5. And I remember this one instance, we'd been talking about it. We do a lot of storytelling, like read books about moving, read books about airplanes. Let's talk about what's going to be like. So at one point, I'm sitting at the table with my daughter and she's eating a snack and all of a sudden she just starts crying. I was like, what is going on? Like, what is wrong? It's just a snack. What's happening? And she's holding her little baby belt. She's like, Mommy, can I take my cheese to Michigan? And I was like, what? Of course, like this one you should eat, but it'll be cheese in Michigan. And so the adjustment there, we talked a lot about how we're not going to see our favorite friends that we see every day here in California. And we can call them on FaceTime, but we're not going to see them all the time. And when can I see them? Well, I don't know. We'll make new friends in Michigan. And she still talks about those friends. She still talks about Cleo and Maggie and her little friends in California. And then the relocation from Michigan to Chicago was a lot happier for us. Michigan, again, like Kevin and I, my husband and I, we didn't know really anybody in Michigan. He knew 2 people from college and I knew no one. It was 4 hours away from all his family, 6 hours away from the closest of my family, and my parents still lived in Nevada. So it was just very, very far from everyone. And I was still doing my same job from California, but I was working virtually. So that was a huge adjustment. And I did the pandemic backwards, right? Everybody started off at home and I started off on the ground in healthcare, suiting up with all the masks and the hazmat suits and everything. And then as everybody's coming out of the pandemic and going back to socialization, here I am like working 8 hours a day in my stupid little office that I hated. It was all gray out the window because it was all winter.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So many things to unpack over there. The first thing that's coming to mind, if you don't mind, could you talk a little bit about what that was like within the relationship that you had with your husband? You know, there you are in school knowing that, hey, wherever he gets residency, that's where we're going to go. And then you end up in California and you have a family there, at least an immediate family, at that, to say the least. And then figuring that out and those dynamics of building a relationship and then moving again from there, that itself has to have some sort of impact within your own intimate family and how you guys are going to be getting along together. I'm curious what that was like for you going to all those places, just having the 2 of you and not having anyone else, and also going in this brand new environment so many times.
Yeah. I knew very much what I was getting into marrying a doctor and a surgeon. I worked with doctors and surgeons my whole career since I was 22. I was very familiar with what their work-life balance was, with what this was going to look like. And on our second date, my husband said to me, he was like, "You seem great. All of this is going great. Don't continue to date me unless you feel like you can end up in Chicago at some point." That was always an expectation in our relationship. And I was fine. I was like, I like Chicago, whatever. Like, I'm not a native to Minnesota. Sure. Did I expect 2 other moves along the way? No. As far as our relationship goes, specifically the transition from resident to fellow during a pandemic in a new institution with people that he didn't know was really, really, really hard for him. And while I was working a hard job that takes a huge emotional toll, I don't feel like it was as difficult for me. And so my role was very much like, just going to let you process this and we're going to be there when we can. And he specifically has always been very, very good at leaving work at work, which is hard to do. Not a lot of surgeons are great at that. And he also is very good at setting aside time for family. He makes a very, very good effort at traveling home to maintain his friendships, maintain his relationship with his family and with me and his daughter. It's really a testament to his strengths in those areas, because all I can say is, hey, I'm feeling neglected. Whether or not he can make time for that is a whole different issue. I will say that one of the hardest things for us specifically in California was not just the transition to a new location, but his transition in responsibilities. He was then doing a lot harder surgeries and had a lot more complications and just things that he hadn't addressed yet in his career. There was one instance when I was having a hard time with my job. I had a really difficult patient. I was really upset about it. She'd asked me to stop all of her medications. And normally we do that when a patient is not able to take all their medications, but she was consciously telling me, I don't want to do this anymore. Please tell the nursing home not to give me these medications anymore. And that was a really hard time for me. I just had never had that happen before. And I came home and I wanted to talk about it. And he was like, well, that's your job. I was like, excuse you? Like, I thought we just talked about that patient you had a hard time with last week. Do you want to unpack that there? Like, let's go. That was probably one of the biggest fights that we ever had. It came away with an understanding. It was like, I support your job and you support mine. And we should be able to talk about these things when they're hard. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, again, there's so many things. And I think this could lead us down a rabbit hole here. But you know what? I think you're bringing up some very good points, especially for spouses that are in the healthcare world, specifically where there is bound to be travel and bound to be relocations. Are there maybe 1 or 2 tips, and before we move on to the next thing, that you would give to parents, to a couple, or maybe future parents that are thinking about, or maybe just starting out on this journey of becoming a doctor and constant relocations, for how they can keep that fire going within the relationship as they start the family process?
I think the biggest thing is make time for each other. When it comes to time in medicine, my husband is at the top of the most hours ever worked. And it's one of those things, if you want to, you will. Even in the pandemic, even in a place where we didn't have resources, you identify your support group, you find a place that other people are like you and support you. And they do a really good job with that in medicine. Usually there's doctors' wives groups. So identify all those things And also, no matter how little or how much he's working or they're working, put it on the calendar. This is my 2 hours with you and only you. And then when you're planning family activities, there's times, in my case, obviously, it's not just daddy, but if we're us, there's times daddy can come and there's times daddy can't. Emphasize those times when he can and be happy with them and take lots of pictures and talk about them. And then when he can't, then it's just mommy and me and we're going to have a great time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And going right into it regarding the family dynamics that it comes up within the relocations and having a child, and then seeing you talk about your daughter wanting to know if she can take stuff with her as she goes places, because the mentality, am I going to be able to take certain things as you go to the next location and hopefully the last? But at the same time, I think there are so many things that come up within the development of a child. You're talking about, here you are in this unfurnished apartment, but your daughter's learning how to crawl and walk. And then you have the verbalization, then you have the cognitive thinking and functioning that's going on. Are there certain things that parents that are going to be relocating based on job situation or based on family situation that you would recommend parents become more aware of when it comes to this type of situation?
I would say that any big life event like this, well, for you, you may be able to say, look at all these bright sides. Look at all these things that are happening that we're excited about. My husband is moving forward in his career. We get to experience a new place. All of those things to us are very concrete and they can offset the grief of leaving where you're coming from. For a child, those are a lot harder to process and think of and picture, especially if you've had a relocation that has been traumatic. Specifically, the California relocation for us, we didn't get into it. Our furniture got stolen. It was a whole thing. And obviously, my daughter was too young to understand that, but she's grown up hearing about that. So then when she realized we were moving to Michigan, there was a lot of, am I going to lose all of my toys? And all of these things are going to be lost. What if the truck doesn't come like you and daddy said? Expecting almost a grief reaction from your child to a move will better prepare you for the reactions that you're getting. Rather than, I don't understand. How come you can't be so excited? We're going to be by grandpa. We're going to be by aunties and uncles and all these people that you love. And just like, yeah, that's great. But my preschool and my friends and my ballet class and all of those things are here in Michigan. This is sad for me, or in California or whatever. I think expecting them to work through these stages of grief in a more prolonged process than an adult would when they can think of all these happy things to a child is harder.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's so much that we can try to prepare our child for. But I think what you're saying is also, Meredith, that it's not just about us being able to be prepared to talk to our child, but it's also about realizing the child, the way they're going to absorb it and the way they're going to talk about it is based for them. And yes, grandpa is very important, but so is ballet class. So is my cheese. In those type of situations, it's really about that's what's important to them and not to undermine that or undervalue what is important to them and say, yeah, you're right. But there are certain things we can do, which I think is a very good way of going about it. Now, I think another big part that comes about this is parents being on the same page as you go through all of the constant moving, relocation, and newness, especially to a child. Can you talk a little bit about how parents can make sure to be on the same page and how to act or maybe even react to situations where there could be a little bit of tension, but no, we have to put our own stuff aside to make sure that for the family dynamics and for our child or our children, we're able to be on the same page and treat them for the whatever it is that they need.
I think communication is just the biggest issue. I'm so lucky I have a husband who values my input in his trajectory of his career. And I say I'm lucky. It should be this way. He actually is that way. I've heard so many horror stories of doctor husbands being like, well, this is the best for my career, so good luck. That is very much not how he approached these moves and changes. We sat down, we made lists, we prioritized. When we did ranking, we did it together. It wasn't like he did rank and I was like, I guess I'll follow you. I was very involved in the rank. And do you know much about ranking? That's a thing.
Yes,
I had nothing.
Yes. Maybe for our listeners, you can explain a little bit.
So when you go into residency, and I wasn't there for that, or when you go into fellowship, you go and you interview all these different places. And then they put into this massive computer program their list of top applicants and who they want first, second, third, fourth, and so on. And then you go in and put in the same computer program your list of top places. And then the computer and all its magic shoots out where you're going to go for fellowship. And that's it. You're going or you don't go to fellowship. It's a lot of game playing. It's a lot of mind games, but it's also a lot of communication because we had a lot of discussions. Are we going to go straight to Chicago? Do we want to rank Loyola first? Do we want to rank Minnesota first so we can stay here? Or are we going to go for the big name institutions that'll get you to the biggest part of your career? And I think being on the same page about my career and my trajectory and his career and his trajectory, and discussing that and saying, I'm not as dedicated to climbing up through the ranks of management and I'm not dedicated to staying in Minnesota. And I think we should both be dedicated to you doing the best that you can in your surgical career so that you can get the job that you want at the end of all of this. Because ultimately, even though my career is important, even though my career is great and I'm passionate about it, your career is going to set us up for the rest of our lives. Being a nurse practitioner is not going to do that. And we had a lot of those discussions. I would say that just open communication is the only tip I have.
Yeah, and I think that goes a very long way when obviously both partners are able to be on the same page together. When you talk about, I think, creating the stability for the child and making sure that they are calm, cool, collected, feel safe, feel secured and loved, and having their cocoon that every child in some way should have. I'm curious, what is the mindset that parents that are going through different changes and transitions and locations, what type of mindset should parents be having as they go about something like this?
At least for me, our primary mindset has always been whatever we're going through, we want to be as united as we can with our daughter. We want to show her that we love each other, that we're doing this together, and that this dynamic isn't changing. Everything else can change, but I am still your mommy and I am still taking care of you. And mommy will, as long as I can, as for through most hell or high water that I can think of, mommy will be here for you. And so will daddy. And this is how we will work through this. And I think saying that to children is really important, but modeling it obviously is more important. And when they're feeling destabilized, when they're feeling grief, you just say, you can tell me that you feel these things. You're not going to be in trouble for crying or being upset. You can bring your cheese or whatever it is that comes up.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I want to push you a little further over here. And we talk about the modeling aspect of things. What does that look like from a mom's point of view that is also trying to be supportive to a husband, trying to be supporting to that spouse that is going to be setting up for life for regarding their careers, but yet also having a certain career for self, but yet also looking for in new locations? How does that sort of work? And what does modeling mean in that sense?
This is going to get very feminist very quickly. Okay.
Thank you for the warning.
Right. There's a whole lot of background on like how I feel about my career versus my husband's career and how I was raised versus how I actually do things. I would say that primarily it is being with her through those things, bringing my husband into these conversations, sitting down together, talking about what things are going to be like, but also not dwelling in my own grief reaction. Because like, yes, as an adult, if you're relocating, you're leaving your friends, you're leaving your support group, you're going to have a grief reaction too. Is it beneficial for my daughter, for me to sit at home and be upset about the people that we're not seeing? No. What are we going to do? We're going to go out. We're going to invite new friends over. We're going to go find new places to love. I think that's the thing that we have done very well in all of the places that we lived. Just explore where you are. Bring your kids with you. Enjoy it. That was a lot harder to do in California than it was to do in Michigan, but we did it. And I think that in that, we kind of bring things back to storytelling, because a way that I tell things to my daughter is to tell her stories about what things are like. And I have one that's not airing on my podcast for a very long time, but it's called The Things That I Want for You. And I sent it to my friend in Australia and she was like, don't send me this. I'm going to cry every time. She's like, what do I want for you? I want you to know that when you get big, your career is important, but your family is important. And you can do both. It's hard. And I want to show you that through how I live. You don't have to lose who you are to be a family. And how do you model that? Well, you keep running your races and you bring your kid to watch you train the marathon and you do all these things, like it's a lot of little things. It's nothing big. It's nothing earth shattering. Am I going to win a marathon? No. But is she going to see me train for them? Yeah. And why do we do this? And talk about it. All of those things, when a kid asks why, it's hard because they do it all the time, to explain to them in the best way that you can why.
You said so many amazing things over there. Just go back a little bit and just what was coming through to me. So as a therapist, one of the things that I work with, unfortunately, a little bit too much is trauma, and specifically developmental trauma and complex trauma that people have been through as they've been growing up in their younger grade school and middle school type years. And one of the things that always stood out to me in any of the trainings that I've done is specifically from, I think, one of the leaders in the trauma world, Bessel van der Kolk, when he talks about it in both his book, The Body Keeps a Score, and also in countless meetings that I've been fortunate to be a part of. He talks about the concept of trauma happens, and trauma is when we move and we lose people because of a relocation is a form of trauma because there is a abandonment there. And when you talk about trauma, and it happens because or through relationships, but the same way that we heal from it is also through relationships. So by creating new, healthier ones or creating things that we like, that we could explore in a way that we're learning more. You use the word curious. You know, the words that Dr. Van der Kolk likes saying is ABC, always be curious. And I think it's those two things specifically is creating healthier attachments, creating situations where we are able to be more around others in new situations and being curious about it. That's how we are able to now become that family dynamic in this new location that we're looking for in such a healthy, mature, and happy way. So that's really what was standing out as you were talking about a relocation. And up until the way you were talking from your daughter, and I'm picturing it because some of my kids have been in situations like, oh my God, can I take this with me? Yeah, we're going in the car. You're allowed to take that thing with you. That concept for them, it's so real. Like, oh my God, I had to give this up. But for them, it's really traumatic what they're going through in that moment. And to hear you, the way you're talking about moving, in some ways, you're making it sound like pretty simple because, hey, just do A, B, and C, be on the same page, everything is good. But at the same time, hopefully people, if they haven't had their own experience in moving, there is a lot involved in that. And it is a traumatic event. And I think just taking that pause for a second and realizing what you're going through right now, it's not simple. It's not easy. And we have to still keep on moving. We have to acknowledge it and move with it. And it's through that movement and not just a body movement, which is obviously a big part of healing from trauma. But I think at the same time, when we talk about getting through a situation that could be difficult, it's through connections to others, through having a supportive spouse, having children that we're bringing into the picture, maybe a dog as well, and then being able to go ahead and say, all right, let's keep on moving, let's keep on doing, and also thinking about the values that we have and the things we're trying to have as our core for what this family is made out of and creating that core identity of what this family is. So that was for sure, I think, the number one thing that stood out for me as you're talking about that. And the other thing that I think is important, and this is something I can't remember where I heard this from, but I always thought it was very profound hearing the concept of struggle. And I think one of the greatest forms of parenting that we can do is teaching our kids that it's normal to struggle. And it's normal that we have adjustments that we make too, whether it's for a marathon, whether it's for furniture, or whether it's for a new location. Palo Alto weather is probably not that different than a lot of other places in the Northeast, but at the same time, there is change. There's a lot of change from Palo Alto going to Chicago. So a parent going through that is also going through something. So therefore, that's something that when a child sees, hey, mommy's also struggling with something.
Yes. Saying, I am also sad. Saying, mommy is also sad about this that's happening. And this is what we're doing. And this is why we're sad. I guess I didn't bring that up, but walking them through your own emotions.
Exactly. That goes a really, really long way. You didn't have to say it. I think it was something that you were able to articulate in the way you were talking and talking about stories and talking about this podcast. I think that's another very, very important way, especially for young children. But I think research that shows it could go up to ages of like teenagers of talking and saying stories and it being something that could be so helpful and so soothing and both for the comprehension of something, but also for the retaining of information. Switching gears over here, and there's so many things to talk about. Can you talk about stories and how that's something that has been a part of your family, but yet also a part of the work that you're currently doing now? Maybe talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now.
Sure. I grew up in a reading family. My mother is a teacher. She loves stories. Everything that we did was we come home with stacks and stacks and stacks of books from the library, and that's what we loved to do. And my brother and I both read very early, and so it's always been a very integral part of me as a person is processing things, how I identified the things that I went through. I did it through all these stories. And that's part of the reason, off topics, part of the reason representation matters so much. Because if you can't find yourself in a story, when you go looking for this comfort and you can't find it, that's the only time as a cisgender white woman that has ever happened to me was when I was pregnant. I wanted a story. I didn't want to hear people talk about it. I wanted a fiction. I wanted a fantasy. I wanted something where that person is the main character and does something new and different and brave. And I could not find it. And it was very hard for me, which sounds very silly sometimes when you say that out loud. But I wanted to find this struggle, the alienation of my own body. I wanted to find that in a story, and I couldn't. So when we write stories, when we tell stories, we want to include as many people as we can. And it doesn't mean that your one story has to include everybody. It means when you're telling stories, you should tell stories that include different people along the way. In the stories that I tell on my podcast, I try not to be very dictatorial. I want them to be fantastical and fun. Obviously, there's lessons to be learned there, but sometimes the lesson is to just be the story. And that's really helpful. I feel like one of the reasons that Harry Potter has been so emblematic of our generation is because, yes, there is a moral. Yes, there were a lot of things to learn, but you did it through magic. And that is so important, I think, in the development of a child, to not have it be so serious all the time, to not have it be so on the nose that you can read these things and experience a sense of wonder and also be learning. I think that's what's a mark of a really good storyteller. And I'm not saying I do that all that well, but I try really hard. The reason that it's so important is that I feel like it gives my daughter a framework of how to work through things, how to identify herself in a story, and hopefully other children too. That's why I tell these stories out in the interwebs.
Where do you get that inspiration from? Is it coming specifically from like personal experiences, or is it things that you want to relate to your daughter or for other kids?
Both, all, everything. I've been writing stories since I was very small. My mom has a box full of hand illustrated picture books that I did when I was 5. I think even the story, one of the first stories that I did on my podcast called There's a Scottish Drummer in My Washer, I wrote that in high school and I illustrated it in high school. It's still just fun to read and I like it, and it brings back growing up Irish dancing. Silly.
So how do you go about taking that passion and that love that you have, and how do you go about dealing with passing it along to your daughter?
I'll still do the things that my mom did with me. We go to the library and we check out stacks of books and we read them. And right now she's like, Mommy, I haven't read any new books in a long time. Oh, okay. I guess we'll work on that. She's like, I've read all of these. Doing that, and the library is a great place to do that. And she listens to my podcast with me. We listen to them together. We talk about it. She likes to sit and watch me illustrate them. And she's my test audience for everything. So she's always 5 steps ahead of everybody else out there as far as the stories go.
What would you say to parents that are having resistance coming from their children that don't want to read so much?
I haven't had that experience, except that my brother was not as ready to jump on the reading train as me. He had a harder time with it. He didn't want to sit still, those sorts of things. He didn't read as easily or as well. And what my mom did, what I saw her do, because now he's just as much of a reader as me. He's into the series and the fantasies and all those things. She just, every night, well, it's reading time. And you don't have to look at the pictures, but you'll sit and you'll listen to me read it to you. And 9 times out of 10, after she gets through page 1, okay, but what happens next? And it was a lot easier back in the 90s because we didn't have a constant screen but I want to watch a movie. I think setting strict limits on your screen time is really helpful. And then having a time, this is a thing that we always do, and starting really early is probably the best thing, but also show them that you like it, I think is another huge deal. Well, yeah, I'm making you read, but I spend all my time scrolling on my phone. Well, I don't want to read. I want to do that. But I noticed the biggest thing with my daughter is if I'm sitting reading a book, she'll want to come, even if it's an adult book with no pictures, she'll want to come and sit on my lap and read the book. And she likes reading, but that's also what worked for my brother who didn't. If I'm reading the book and I like it, well, I got to figure out why you like that.
That's great. I think that goes a very long way with reading with your children, whether it's you reading your stuff and them reading theirs. There's a certain camaraderie that's like created by being able to sit with them in that sense. And something else that you triggered in my head, one of my kids having suffered from severe ADHD and working through a lot of different doctors and stuff. And thank God he's come a very long way from where he was. And one of the things that we were told was to read to him, considering that one of his problems that he was having was his eye tracking. And he was constantly going back to the word before, probably almost double the amount of what was normal for kids his age at the time. And we were told to read it to him and to start with Harry Potter. You know, he was, I think, 7 years old when that started. And we couldn't read just one chapter because there was always like, and what next? And I was very, very adamant on making sure that we got through the entire book before he watched the movie, because I felt that there's a really important part of a kid's imagination being made on their own instead of it being made for them. And nothing against the movies. And I think they're pretty good overall. But I think that the books, in a way, this is probably in most situations where the book is better than the movie because of the imagination you get to use when you're doing it. So I think there are so many things that can come about through reading, and hopefully through people listening to your podcast, which we will hopefully get a chance to hear a little bit more about as we go a little further over here, but yet also we'll post a link to it in the show notes. I want to transition a little bit over here, if you don't mind, to talking about different movings that you've gone through, and having a child and then also expecting, and how that comes into play regarding the family dynamics and how that develops within itself, but specifically with your daughter as well.
Mm-hmm. I guess at first, my husband and I got married. We were a bit older than a lot of our friends. Most of our friends were already on their second kid by the time that we got married. We knew that we wanted to start a family right away. So right after we got married, we were like, okay, let's start working on this. And it was very easy. We had one very early loss, but that wasn't, we're just like, oh, that happens. It was like 4.5 weeks, 5 weeks. The only reason we knew was because we'd been trying. And then we had Reagan, and it wasn't an easy pregnancy for me, but it wasn't, as far as pregnancies go. The only reason it was hard was because I broke my leg because I was rock climbing like an idiot. And, I had fibroids, which happens. It was a very normal pregnancy. There was no reason for me to be anxious about pregnancy. And as far as bringing a child into the world, this is not the experience of most of my friends. But because I grew up in a conservative church environment, I had been very well trained at how to take care of children because that had been my job forever. And then I was a nurse, and I worked as a pediatric nurse for a little bit, and I knew what I was getting into. Yes, I was like, the conceptualization of less sleep, like I can't hand this infant over to somebody else at 12 hours and be like, it's your problem now. I knew that was going to be a problem, but I also knew what babies were like, how to feed them. So that's not the experience of most people that I know. And even my husband, he spent a lot of time thinking he might want to be a pediatric surgeon. And while they're not as hands-on with the day-to-day care of the infants or the children that they're working with, who is exposed to it, he's one of 4 kids, he's not the youngest, there wasn't a huge shock into having this baby that was dependent on us. I think after that, I really struggled with finding myself again. I think that's an experience that's pretty universal. Like having the baby part wasn't the problem. My body not being able to do the things that it used to be able to do, and working back up through a fitness perspective, that was very hard for me. And owning my body again. I breastfed for a full year, and man, the recommendations are for 2. And at a year, I was like, we are done here. Like, I want nothing attached to my body anymore.
Yeah, my wife did the same thing. So.
And thank goodness I had a self-weaning baby. She weaned herself. We were very much on the same page. It was very great. But I still had a hard time being like, okay, we're going to be ready for a second baby. And that was after the year. I told my husband, I want the kids to be close together at a year. We can try again. And then things got really difficult. It took us, before it was like, oh, we just tried and we had a baby. Wow. The next time it took us a full 6 months to even conceive the first time. And we lost that pregnancy at 7 weeks, which it feels bad to say like this miscarriage is worse than this miscarriage is worse than, but it was a lot harder for me, that one, because I had felt like things were going to be fine. We had had a good heartbeat check. Things were great. And everything was measuring on track. And
you were already a mom. So that also comes into play.
Yes. And then after that, because it had taken us so long, because I was 35, we met with a fertility doctor. And he was like, I don't see any reason why things should be wrong, but let's hard with scheduling, with your husband working so much. We'll try IUI, which is intrauterine insemination, where instead of the whole IVF thing where you take the shots, you take all the injections, they give you a week of medication to stimulate your ovaries to release more follicles. You take 1 shot to release those. You go in for the procedure and they go past the cervix and they inject a very concentrated sample of sperm. And you have a much higher rate of getting pregnant with something like that. And we did 2 rounds. The first one failed. The second one worked. But then we went in for the 6-week check and it wasn't developing. So they had gotten to 4 weeks and just stopped. And they were like, why that would be, but we're going to make you think about it for a week. And if it's not getting any bigger, then we're going to have to either wait for it to clear on its own, like come out, for you to start bleeding, or we can induce you.
I want to just puzzle here for a second. I just want to talk about, this is a heavy thing to be talking about. And I think anyone that's gone through any sort of infertility, this is something that it's hard. Could you talk a little bit about what the family dynamics were like and what your relationship was like during this time and what you were able to build and fall on, maybe, if that's the right word to use, during these times?
I think those 2 specifically were probably, as far as a relationship goes, I won't say they were the hardest, but they were very difficult because the institution that we were at they were not supportive of my husband. And so when we got this news, I was by myself both times. And it took a while to get a hold of him. I had to go to the ER by myself. I had called one of his co-fellows who was sitting with me in the ER for the first one because we didn't have anybody to watch my daughter. He was home, thank God, with her. Otherwise, he would have been at the hospital and she would have been with a nanny. I think that not having that institutional support was the hardest for those two, because I called him, he was in the middle of surgery when he got that second call and for the second one. And basically it was like, that sucks. I'll see you at home. I gotta go. And it was because he had this person in the background being like, what are you doing? Get off your phone. We gotta get things going. I feel like it was beneficial in some ways because it very much created a us against them. Like, we are the unit and buckets, you meanies. But as far as processing that, it was isolating. I mean, it is. Infertility is very isolating, even if you can read about it, even if you can hear about it, even if you know that other people have had the same experiences. I think one of the things that we tell women who are going through these losses a lot is, well, this happens to everybody. You're not alone. And while that is nice to know that, no, it is not just my body that is failing me, it feels very trivializing a lot.
Yes.
And, well, at least you know that you can get pregnant again. Well, I hate you.
Right.
And I don't want to ever.
That's probably not the words that you were saying in your head as they were saying that.
Words.
Yes. Wow. Wow. And just to even think about the fact that there you are going through this and not having your husband there with you, obviously did create a certain us against them, which sounds like in some ways was actually beneficial. That's the right word to say regarding like a silver lining to this. And I don't know if there is a silver lining when it comes to losing a child.
There's no, but I mean, there's just a way to say it, right? Like,
at the same time, being alone and just not having your partner there with you has got to be something that was so hard. And can you talk about, if you're okay talking about it, that first time where you actually see him and you guys have a conversation and what that was like?
I actually really can't, because I don't remember it. That's part of the ways that I try to process bad things, just kind of like look it out. We came home and we were both sad. And for those two specifically, my daughter was very young. She was only a year and a half. Like, I think with the first one, we had told her that she was going to have a sibling. And then we just were like, no, not anymore. And she was like, whatever. And like, just, she couldn't process, didn't care. We had asked her before, like, do you want a baby sibling? And she was like, no. So, okay. There was a lot less to go through there. And I think that the things that stick out to me more than the reaction to those two losses together is how it changed our process going forward. The conflict for us certainly came when he was like, I really feel like we should just go straight to IVF. And there were several times where I was like, no, this is so invasive and it's so much. And I already was a lot for me to go through IUI. And I really feel like we should just give this, we already have to be on this wait list for forever to get in on Michigan's IVF team. Like, why don't we try naturally for a little bit longer? We know we can. Maybe we just got bad luck a couple times.
So can you talk about that for a second, just regarding the partnership dynamics in this conversation and what people that might be going through something like this can expect, but also maybe some guidance?
So first of all, I would say that if you're the supportive partner, right, if you're not the partner whose body has processed this loss and gone through the hormonal changes and gone through the waking, it's, as much as you may be a very empathetic and emotionally intelligent person, you don't know what it's like. And especially in a doctor relationship, like, don't you talk to me like you talk to a patient. Don't you do that. I'm your wife. And I'm sick of hearing this from everybody else. You act like a partner. You don't act like my doctor. And that was a thing that
very well said.
I had to talk about a lot. And I think that the advice would be, because I remember very specific, I think probably the worst thing I've ever said to my husband, here, you all get to hear it, is I was very upset and I was very angry. We were talking about trying again. And he's like, I'm here with you. And I said, then why do I feel like I'm doing it alone? It's mean. It's not a good thing to say. But it also was very much how I was feeling, because this isn't happening to your body. And yes, you can be sad, but you don't feel like something has died in your body and you don't feel like you're at fault here. Whereas even all the medicine in the world and all the advice and all the research can say that this is not a thing that I did. It can feel that way. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what science says. It matters how I feel. And it is, what if And then there's a lot of insecurities that come up too. When my husband and I got married, he wanted 6 kids. And I was like, you're going to have to find a younger girl because it's not going to happen. So then there was a lot of that we had to talk through. Like, are you going to leave me if I can't give you another baby? Like, is this a thing? No, it's not. And he was like, I want you and I want our family. And we have one beautiful child and she's wonderful. And if this is all we have, is we're still going to be great. It's a very different conversation than you have when you haven't ever had a baby, right? If you're experiencing losses like this, you haven't had a child. That's a whole different set of conversations. It's a whole different set of grief.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to take a moment just to sort of recognize where you are right now and make sure everything's okay in this conversation because it's a tough one.
It is. It gets worse, unfortunately.
Yes. Okay. So before we get there, I just want to talk about one more thing. We're talking about doing this alone. And I think that concept, well, it could be a very hard thing for a partner that's not going through this with their body to hear. But I think sometimes, and something else that you said was also very profound, talking about like, I don't care what science says. I know how I feel. And I think that's a very good recognition or acknowledgement for all couples going through anything together, that it's not about what the professionals say. It's not about what the therapists say or the doctors, NIH. It's really about what's happening within the dynamics of the two of you and the two of us. And I think that's really important for that to be acknowledged. So here you are losing a second child, and I'm curious where things went from there. But before we go there, you could just check us in regarding where you guys are as a family and as a family unit.
Location-wise or?
Like emotionally.
I think after those two, we were in the process of moving to Michigan. We had a nice space. We were like, well, we know, again, he was ultimately right? I didn't like how he said it, but he was right. We know you can get pregnant. Great. It's not an issue of you being able to get pregnant. We know that we have a lot of changes coming up. And so we're just going to take a step back. We'll have until we get on the Michigan IVF team, and we'll try naturally till then, is kind of the compromise that we came up with. And emotionally, and as a unit, we kind of set all that aside because we're like, and now we're moving to Michigan. All of that is in the past, and we have this other big thing that we need to focus on. And Michigan was a kind of a surprise move for us. It was a year delay in the plan. Working through that was a little bit harder than the move to California. But we were like, we're going to focus all our energy on finding out how to belong in Michigan and finding our places to live and dealing with that, spending time with the family that's closer in Chicago and going from there. We didn't put a lot of time or energy into processing those two losses, which can sound good or bad depending on, were we distracting ourselves? Well, yeah. Yes.
But at the same time, I think like you're saying before, there's a certain point where mom has to say, we got to keep on moving. The message that you were giving over to your daughter. And I think the MO of what you've been talking about today is you got to keep on moving. So yeah, we're dealing with this monumental, life-changing ordeal and event. But at the same time, life keeps on going. So we got to do certain things. So that's where you are.
Yeah. What happened next was we got to Michigan and I got naturally pregnant total of 3 more times. The first 2 were very early losses, like the one I had before my daughter. And then in the midst of fighting with the infertility specialist, because there's a lot of things that are more experimental in fertility medicine. They're more theoretical. There's a lot less hard facts in science. And so when you're at a big name institution, sometimes they're like, well, we only deal with hard facts. And you're like, well, there's not a lot of those. So could you work with me here? Especially when you get into recurrent pregnancy loss, which I have diagnosed fetal intolerance, which is super fun to hear on your medical chart. There's really not much data on what is going to help you, especially if they can't find anything wrong with you. If you don't have a clotting disorder, if you don't have anything, they just can't find anything. So for the 3rd natural pregnancy that we had there, actually, I didn't convince the infertility team. I did a bad thing, and I had my husband write me a prescription for progesterone, which is not a privilege that's granted to many. But it was something that we had an OB friend who worked in fertility in Minnesota, and she was in a small practice, and she's like, this is what I would do with a person in your situation. And so we tried it, and it worked. And we got pregnant again, a healthy baby boy. Everything was going great. We had genetic testing. Everything was fine. We made it through. They were doing extra checks with me because I was a nervous wreck. They were doing serial heart monitoring checks. And I went in for the 15-week check and there was no heartbeat. And that was by far, like when we talk about these other losses that happened before, I don't think about those anymore because that one was so much bigger and more horrible because we had told our daughter, who at that point was 3.5 and very excited. And she told me every day, I'm so excited to have a baby brother, mommy. It wasn't very long for her. We didn't tell her until I was 12 weeks pregnant, but 3 weeks in a 3-year-old's life is a really long time. She'd been reading a book every night about how to prepare for a new baby.
Now she's going to be a big sister.
It's going to take a really long time. Yeah, now she's going to be a big sister. So that was just a whole, I had to go in for a DNC.
Can you explain people what a DNC is?
Yes. A DNC is, what happened with the pregnancy was that it's called a miscarriage. The baby had probably died around 13 weeks and we didn't catch it until 15 weeks. And my body had not noticed. My body had kept going like there was a normal pregnancy. So that was, you immediately are very high risk for a lot of things like infection, primarily infection. What they recommended, they said, again, we could wait for you to deliver this naturally, which sounded horrible and traumatic to me because at that point you can see a fetus that comes out and that's terrible and awful. And they said, or you could do a DNC, which is where they sedate you. It wasn't like general anesthesia, but I don't remember any of it. And we go in and they go in vaginally and take out all of the fetal tissue and placenta and all those things. And they were very supportive. They were like, you can wait till you wake up and you can see the baby and you can hold it and you can name it and you can cremate it and whatever you want. And I was like, I don't want to do any of that. I want to be asleep. I want to wake up and it's going to be over. And that was right for me, but it's not right for everybody. Obviously, they have those things because some people, it helps them process. So that's what a DNC is when they go in and they manually have to extract all that pregnancy tissue. I do want to say, just because we had talked before about how the last institution that we were at was not particularly supportive. The institution that we were at in Michigan was just extremely supportive. Again, he called my husband he had a horrible night anyway. I called him out of surgery and his attending, he was like, you go home right now. I need to be with your wife and don't call me again until you're okay. And that was just so different and such the supportive environment.
I'm sure it was refreshing to the two of you.
Yes. I met this man. I mean, I've known him for a while, but I saw him again at some graduation party or whatever. And he was like, Meredith. And I gave him a big hug and he was like, oh, I don't do hugs. I'm sorry. Just want to say thank you so much for supporting our family. It was just a much better experience in a terrible way, right?
Not that there could be a good experience in this, but out of the experiences that you've been through, considering what you guys have been through, I think this was something that regarding the healing process and the grief and working through that is something that was a much more supportive environment.
Yes. But it was by far the most difficult one to work through.
How many weeks in were you?
I was 15 weeks. So you kind of think you're home free. We figured it out, what was wrong with us. We got past the first trimester. That's when statistically, you're at less than 1% risk for miscarriage. And here we are. And then you got to go home and you got to tell your daughter that she's not going to be a big sister anymore. And everybody knows about this pregnancy. So it's not just your mom. It's not just your husband. You got to deal with everyone you've ever talked to in the last 3 weeks wanting to be there for you, which is so great, but it also can feel really invasive.
Okay, so can you talk about that, please, for a second? Because I think both for the person that is wanting to give their love and support, but yet also for the person receiving it, how they can both talk and communicate within situations like this.
So this is going to go back to hospice mentality, dealing with just loss in general. It's different than losing a child that you've already birthed. It's different than a stillbirth. It's different than losing a family member, I think. But when you're approaching somebody that's in a grieving situation, making them talk about it is not appreciated, generally speaking. They don't need you to process their grief for them. They don't need to hear about your experiences. If they ask you or if it becomes a natural conversation, yes, that's different. If you're in a supportive friend conversation, that's different. I had a lot of strangers mailing me gifts, which is so nice. But then I opened them and I would cry. I'd be at work, open this. And in my experience, and also I think is supported by the data, if you tell somebody, I will be there for you, you can talk to me if you want. I will bring you food. I will watch your kid if you need me to. And give them space. Because if you just say, I'm here if you need me, tell me what you need, no one's ever going to do anything with that. No one's going to say, oh, can you do this? If you give them an offer.
Specific.
I can bring you food. I can. And then when can I do that for you? Then it's on them to say, actually Tuesday would be great. Or I don't have any food in the house and I can't get off my couch because I'm miserable. Or could you just take my daughter for 5 minutes while I sit here so she doesn't see me losing my shit? Sorry.
Very well used, so it's fine.
Yeah. Then that's a lot more supportive than I feel than calling you up and being like, oh, I'm thinking of you. How are you doing? And while you can have a place for that, sometimes, especially if you have a person that's very private, you can feel like I'm running through this story with everybody all the time. And it hurts me every time. We didn't get into it, but part of the reason I am a hospice nurse is because I lost my father when I was 14 to cancer. And I felt the same then at 14 when church people were showing up at our house and wanting to sit down. I've never met you in my life. Don't sit down with me and try to talk to me about how I'm feeling. I don't know you. I don't care. I want you to go away. That's a very teenage reaction to guilt, right?
For sure. Yes. Working with teenagers in my office when I'm not podcasting, it's something that I come across all the time.
Yes. And so there's a way to interact with a teenager that's grieving. And then there's a way to interact with an adult that's lost pregnancy. But I feel like offering support, but not forcing support is key.
Hey, everyone. I'm sorry for cutting this interview a little bit short over here. But to be honest, it was pretty heavy one, pretty emotional. And I felt that I wanted to give it the time that it needs. So we divided this into 2 separate recordings. So please stay tuned for episode number 2 coming out next week. If you have any questions or concerns or comments for this podcast, please feel free to email me at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Hey again. I hope you were able to learn as much as I did today. Thank you so much for staying to the end and listening to the entire interview. Please feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. All comments will be read weekly, and we appreciate all feedback and ideas. If you have an idea for a guest or a specific topic, please feel free to share. Additionally, you can contact us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining today, and remember, parenting is a journey. Don't forget to enjoy it. The goal is to be a little better today than yesterday, and hopefully better tomorrow than we were today.